All right, let's jump right in. We've got a question for you that sounds pretty simple, maybe something you'd hear at trivia night, but it's actually way more of a historical mystery than you'd think. The question is, who was the very first scientist? Now, if I ask you to picture that person, what comes to mind? For a lot of us, it's probably someone in a toga, right? You're thinking of the ancient Greeks. Maybe a genius like Euclid, who basically invented geometry with his mind. Or Ptolemy, who mapped out the entire cosmos just by using logic. Or hey, maybe your mind jumps forward a bit to the Renaissance. You might be picturing a rebel like Galileo, peering through his telescope and completely flipping our understanding of the universe on its head. And look, those are all great guesses. But, as we're about to find out, they might not actually be our guy. See, the real answer here, it all comes down to one thing: evidence. It's kind of like a detective story. Before we can point a finger and say, that's him, we have to agree on what we're even looking for. So let's do that. Let's start the investigation by laying out the rules. Okay, first things first, what actually makes a scientist, especially by today's standards? To solve this whole mystery, we've got to establish the ground rules of our investigation. And here's our first clue, and honestly, this one's a bit of a shocker. The word scientist, it's super recent. It didn't even exist until 1834. A philosopher named William Weevil came up with it. So what that tells us is we're not looking for someone who had the job title on a business card. We're looking for the very first person who actually did the work. So this is our checklist. Think of it as the modern scientist's toolkit. To be a scientist, it's not enough to just think something is true. You have to run experiments. You've got to embrace math as a basic tool. You have to try and look at the facts without any bias. And maybe most important of all, you have to share your results so other people can check your work, to prove you're right or maybe even prove you're wrong. So let's take this list and see how our suspects measure up. All right, first up in our investigation, the early suspects. We're heading back in time all the way to ancient Greece to put some of history's most brilliant minds on the stand. So in our lineup, we've got guys like Thales of Miletus, Euclid, the father of geometry, and the astronomer Ptolemy. There's no denying their genius. Their ideas about logic, math, and the stars, they literally built the foundation for Western thinking for the next 2,000 years. So how did they do against our checklist? Well, they were absolute masters of logic and math, so they get a check mark there. But there's a huge piece missing. They didn't really run experiments to prove or disprove their ideas. Their conclusions came from pure reason, from thinking really, really hard, not from physical evidence. They argued brilliantly, but they didn't test. So as amazing as they were, they're not our first scientists. So our investigation moves on. We're going to jump forward in time to the Islamic Golden Age. And it's here that we find a really compelling lead. A pioneer whose whole approach looks, well, surprisingly modern. A lot of historians will point to a man named Ibn al-Haytham. He was based in what is now Iraq. And he wasn't just a philosopher, he was a doer. The guy invented the pinhole camera to figure out how vision works. He figured out the laws of refraction for light. He used actual experiments to study things like rainbows and eclipses. He's definitely 100% checking that experiment box. But there's still a bit of a question mark. You see, scholars today aren't totally sure just how modern his method was. Was his work completely separate from the mysticism or the sort of philosophical beliefs of his time? It's a little fuzzy. And because of that, our case for the very first scientist, it's still open. Okay, so this is where we get a breakthrough in the case. It brings us to our prime suspect, a guy you've probably never even heard of. But he just might be the person we've been searching for this whole time. His name? William Gilbert. So William Gilbert was an English doctor born way back in 1544. He went to Cambridge, became a really big deal as a physician, so much so that he ended up being the personal doctor to Queen Elizabeth I. Pretty cool, right? But it wasn't his day job that made him famous in the long run. It was his obsession, his side hustle, you could say, studying magnets. And that's what changed everything. And if you're looking for a solid character witness, well, here's the smoking gun. Galileo Galilei. Yeah, that Galileo. He called William Gilbert the founder of the scientific method. I mean, an endorsement from Galileo? It really doesn't get any better than that. And the proof is all laid out in his big book from 1600 called De Magnete, which just means on the magnet. In it, he basically throws out all the old, untested ideas. Instead, he called for sure experiments and demonstrated arguments. But here's the absolute game changer. He wrote down his experiments in so much detail that anyone, and I mean anyone, could do them again to check his work. This wasn't some secret knowledge. It was an open invitation to the world. Go ahead, test my results. And that checks every single box on our list. So, you might be wondering, where does a guy like Gilbert fit in with the household names, Galileo and Francis Bacon? Well, he wasn't just some genius working all by himself. He was actually a pivotal player right at the very beginning of modern science. Here's a good way to think about it. You had Francis Bacon, who was kind of like the philosopher of science. He's the one who wrote the big speeches and championed the idea of this new scientific way of thinking. But Gilbert and Galileo, they were the ones actually doing it. They were the practitioners, the ones in the lab, getting their hands dirty, running the experiments, and showing everyone that, hey, this method actually works. So when you lay out all the evidence, the verdict seems pretty clear. While Galileo gets all the glory, the facts show that Gilbert was there first. He was pioneering that hands-on experimental method that Galileo would make famous. So the title of first scientist? It really seems to belong to the much lesser known, but incredibly important William Gilbert. But the real takeaway here isn't just a name. The most important thing that was discovered wasn't a person, it was a process. The true hero of this whole story is the method itself. This revolutionary idea that we don't have to just take someone's word for it, that we can actually figure out how the world works by testing it over and over with experiments that anyone can verify. That scientific method, the one Gilbert put into practice, well, it became the key that unlocked the entire modern world. We're talking everything from medicine to space travel. It literally built the world we live in today. And that brings us to a final big question to chew on. If that method, the repeatable, verifiable experiment, was the key to unlocking our modern age, what's going to be the key that unlocks the next one? Thanks for joining us.